Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Taksashila's postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of All Things Policy. I'll be your host for today, and my name is Kripa Koshy. I am a staff program manager here at the Takshashila Institution, where I manage our postgraduate program in public policy. But today I have real pleasure of having a guest with me today, who's one of my colleagues from the Geostrategy Programme. So welcome, Vanshika.
Thank you, Kripa.
Lovely to have you on. I'm just going to do a formal introduction for you before we jump into the meat and potatoes of what we're trying to discuss today. So Vanshika Saraf is a research analyst for the Geostrategy Programme at Takshashila. Her research focuses on India's engagement with partner countries, East Asian politics, and regional security dynamics in the neighborhood. So this is really good news for all of us because you're going to be the person I ask a few questions to about what we're sort of seeing as this fast brewing rivalry playing out between China and Japan. So maybe without too much further ado, I'll just jump into the first question here, Vanshika. So there's a fair bit of this escalation now that's been going on for those who've been following the news between Japan and China. And I think a really significant moment in that bilateral relationship was in November 2025, when we saw the Japanese PM declared that a Chinese attack on Taiwan would actually constitute a survival-threatening situation. So I know you've written about some of this, Vanshika, and one of the pieces that you flag in that analysis is that, this is that type of language is a fairly precise legal formulation that could actually permit the deployment of Japan's self-defense forces. So could you maybe help us understand, some of the implications of that type of statement, how it possibly violates the 1972 China-Japan joint statement? Just sort of fill out the picture for us, if you could.
Yeah, sure. Sure, Kripa. Thank you so much for that question. So, as you rightly pointed out, the phrase in question, survival threatening situation, is a very specific legal term in Japan's sort of post-2015 security framework. And this happened after a few iterations, the 2014 cabinet decision, the 2014 legislation, under which Japan can use forces in limited circumstances. One, either when there is an armed attack against a country that is in close relationship with Japan, or there's an attack that threatens Japan's survival, or poses a clear danger to the Japanese people's rights to life, liberty, and happiness. So this is the exact wording from their law. So when Takaichi made that comment and said that a Chinese attack could constitute such a situation, she was effectively saying that any contingency around Taiwan could cross the legal threshold for Japan's self-defense forces, or the SDF, to act. And this is what made this statement so sensitive, right? It basically moved Japan's position, which was always strategic concern, to a very possible legal basis for military involvement. Now, you also pointed out about the China-Japan communique. Now, the connection to the 1972 communique is crucial. So in that statement, Japan had basically recognized the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. So China, for its part, stated that Taiwan was an inalienable part of the territory of PRC. And Japan, in response, said it fully understands and respects this Chinese position. And so this formulation basically became the political foundation for the normalization of relations between China and Japan. But having said that, Japan's position has always had a degree of ambiguity. So Tokyo does not exactly use the same language as Beijing does on the One China principle. Japan does recognize the PRC as the sole government, but it has generally stopped short of explicitly saying that it recognizes Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. And this ambiguity is what has allowed Japan for the longest time to maintain working level relations with Taiwan while also preserving that 1972 framework. So Japan's own sort of diplomatic language also describes Taiwan relations more in terms of being a private, regional, and non-governmental framework in nature. But from Beijing's perspective, this remark by Prime Minister Takaichi, it sort of disturbed this balance in two ways. One, it sort of internationalized the Taiwan question, right? Because China treats Taiwan as an internal matter. But by Tokyo saying that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could threaten its own survival, it basically framed the issue not just as a domestic issue, but as a direct national security issue for Japan. So this was the first. And second, it also, of course, introduced the possibility of a military involvement by Japan. And so this sort of encroached upon the understanding that they had reached for a very long time, that Japan would avoid any sort of political or military position that could be reading as treating Taiwan as separate from China. But by invoking this terminology, this legal category that can permit SDF deployment, Japan basically signaled that it could act militarily. So yes, I would say that the remarks did not necessarily amount to a formal violation of the communique, but it was seen by Beijing as violating its political spirit, is how I would put it. And this is why, Beijing interpreted it as crossing a sort of red line.
Yeah, I think that's really sort of helpful to set the tone for, I think, the rest of the conversation we want to unpack, of how there have been this fair bit of sort of rapid change almost between the relationship between the two countries. I think one thing you had alluded to earlier was just how the military sort of flavor of this relationship has sort of been shifting. More recently, you've talked about how, Japan has made these very rapid sort of shifts in some of its strategy, by deploying like 1,000-kilometer range Type 12 standoff missile near Taiwan, sending a destroyer through the Taiwan Strait, and even just this radical change in some ways of overhauling, really well-established arms export rules that they sort of had to allow for actually the sale of lethal weapons as well. So, I mean, in your view, what do you think we should sort of see or understand when we hear about some of these structural defense sort of overhauls? Do you feel like this is also marking a bit of an end to this sort of reputation or identity that Tokyo's had for a while as being this very restrained and pacifist power? So yeah, just some thoughts on that would be great.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I would just start with a small clarification. So the 1,000-kilometer upgraded Type 12 is actually deployed at Kumamoto, not necessarily close to Taiwan, but there is a discussion of deployment on this island called Yonaguni, which is roughly about 110 kilometers from Taiwan, which is a planned medium-range surface-to-air missile. So this is just a slight distinction, but basically both developments point in the same direction, that Japan is turning its sort of southwestern island chain into a more active denial zone rather than just being sort of this passive defensive perimeter. So on your broad question, right, there is a shift that Japan is no longer positioning itself simply as some sort of rare area support base for the United States, which it was understood to be for a long time. So the Ryukyu Island arc, which runs down towards Taiwan, basically, this gives Japan a geographic role in not only monitoring, but also potentially constraining Chinese naval and air movement from the East China Sea into the wider sort of Western Pacific. Now, the Type 12 and other standoff capabilities that you mentioned, these are central to this transformation because they will allow Japan to hold adversary naval assets or missile launch sites or any other amphibious force at a distance. So I would say this does not automatically make Japan an offensive power in the classical sense, but it does mean that Japan is moving from this posture of very territorial defense after attack to sort of deterrence and, denial before and during a crisis. So in practical terms, China would now also have to factor in these changes, Japanese missiles, sensors, bases, greater sort of operational coordination between US and Japan during a Taiwan contingency. Now, on the second bit, this destroyer sort of transiting through the Taiwan Strait, I think that was an interesting development because Japan has traditionally been very cautious about symbolic moves around Taiwan. And so a destroyer passing through the strait is definitely a signal that Tokyo is willing to treat the strait as a part of its regional commons and not just sort of a domestic political issue surrounding China and Taiwan. And the third that you mentioned was is the arms export export overhaul. So recently, Japan has scrapped restrictions that limited its defense exports to certain categories, which were rescue, warning, surveillance, minesweeping. But now it's opened the way for exports of even warships and other military systems. So this helps Japan in two ways. Mostly, one, it strengthens its own defense industrial base, which will be a huge boost for its own economy. And second is a geopolitical argument also. It allows Japan to become sort of the security provider for partners nearby in the Indo-Pacific, so Philippines, Australia, even India. So other like-minded states that are quite concerned about US moves. I think it provides Japan that sort of inroad into being a security provider. But on your question on does this mark sort of the definitive end of Japan's post-war pacifist identity? I would be a little careful here. It does maybe mark the end of a passive style of pacifism, but not necessarily the end of constitutional restraint. So, Japan's Article 9 still renounces war and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. The government's own interpretation remains that Japan may possess only the minimum necessary level of force for self defense. Now, even though what counts as minimum and necessary has expanded over the last few years. But I think overall, to better formulate it, Japan is not abandoning pacifism wholesale. It is redefining it through deterrence. So the older model was built around, very low defense spending, a very restricted export environment, a lot of ambiguity on issues, and a very, very heavy reliance on the US alliance. Now, given that that has come into question, American extended deterrence in the region, that is why there's now an emerging model, which is, okay, we need more standoff capabilities, a more integrated air and missile defense, greater defense industrial production. So I think in these ways, Japan's role has been changing, and yeah, it's reacting to sort of a very deteriorating regional security environment.
I think, yeah, that's helpful to sort of draw out the distinction of places where Tokyo is trying to be nimble and responsive to how its context is sort of shifting and evolving, right? I think another piece that I was curious about, Vanshika, was, you write about also the diplomatic sort of flavor of how this dispute has sort of played out, right? There's a lot of, institutional signaling that, you've mentioned has been going on. One of the examples that I know some of your research covers is, Japan's 2026 diplomatic blue book that downgraded China to an important neighboring country, which is a bit of a shift. Similarly, seeing Beijing actually submit a working paper to the NPT review conference, which seems to be a bit of an effort to internationalize Japan's domestic nuclear debate. So how are we supposed to sort of interpret some of these, diplomatic downgrading sort of actions, how both countries are trying to involve, the multilat sort of community to try and shape perhaps a global narrative of how these two countries are seen. So just thoughts on some of that would be great.
This is again an important sort of vector into where the escalation is playing out. So the diplomatic dimension is also important because, both are trying more than just to criticize each other, right? They're also, by doing all of these publicly, they're trying to sort of define the meaning of the crisis for third countries, for third parties, and how they will come to view it. So I think it's important in that sense. Now, as you pointed out, Japan's 2026 diplomatic blue book, it basically downgraded China from being one of Japan's most important bilateral relations to an important neighboring country. Now, this blue book is an annual official record of Japan's foreign policy, which is published by their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So any changes in this wording, in any of these wordings, are very deliberate acts of, signaling. And Japan's foreign minister himself said that the wording was based on a comprehensive assessment, while also insisting that Tokyo still seeks a mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interests and constructive and stable relations. So by doing this, I would say Japan is doing two things at once, right? First, it's showing Beijing that, look, it will no longer be treated as some sort of an exceptional partner. But second, it's also preserving enough diplomatic language to avoid a complete rupture. So it's trying to say that, look, China is important, remains important, but it is now being treated more as a source of risk, of coercion, of challenge to crisis management than actually being just a privileged economic partner. because it cites gives a lot of instances of Chinese coercive measures, the recent export controls on semiconductor materials, on rare earths, on radar lock-on incidents, and just the pressure around Taiwan. So that's the first thing. On the second point of how China is also using its weight in multilateral forums, it was quite interesting because China recently, sort of as you mentioned, mobilized the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which is happening in New York, and it's trying to multilateralize or internationalize Japan's domestic nuclear debate. So it submitted a working paper on Japan's alleged nuclear armament tendencies. So clearly, it's trying to shift the focus from this bilateral dispute to a question of international non-proliferation. And even the content of the working paper is quite revealing because it highlights Japanese domestic remarks about revising the three non-nuclear principles, about Japan's plutonium stockpile, rising defense spending, and it basically is asking all NPT states that look, take Japan's alleged nuclear inclination seriously. It's urging Japan to reaffirm its obligations to the NPT, and it even calls for more targeted IAEA safeguards and attention towards Japan. So it's interesting, that Japan is using its own diplomatic blue book to sort of frame China as this sort of, coercive challenger, whereas China is using the UN system to frame Japan as some sort of, revisionist actor. So each side is trying to occupy, the moral high ground. Tokyo wants audiences to see that, look, we are just making all these changes as a response to Chinese pressure. And Beijing wants international audience to see Japan's defense normalization as a revival of militarism, as a threat to the post-war order, right? So I think apart, as we've discussed, apart from competing militarily, economically, they're also sort of competing on this image, right? Who is going to be seen as the defender of that order and who is going to be seen as a disruptor? So I think the danger here is that all of these back and forth moves reduces space for compromise, because once each side internationalizes and publicly opines their position, then stepping back becomes politically very harder for each of those nations.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that actually, Vanshika, because I think that was a question that I had lurking in my mind of, when there is a lot of this activity that you're inviting an audience to behold, what does it look like then for each party to possibly take steps back from some of these positions and stances, right? And how that is a bit of an unwieldy kind of process as well. But maybe if I could expand our conversation slightly beyond now these two countries, like you just rightly said, the international audience is watching, and not just watching, but has been invited into a lot of this debate and discussion. Where does India stand in all of this, right? What should India's response be? What are the implications for India possibly when this bilateral relationship is so dynamic and evolving so rapidly?
Right. Yeah, I think for India, there are a few things, right? One, it definitely has to see these developments as sort of a part of a larger, transition in the Indo-Pacific, where the balance of power is, very clearly shifting. A lot of that has to do with American commitments to the Indo-Pacific. But I think overall, for India, Japan's a strengthened Japan is useful, because a stronger Japan will help distribute the burden of security in the region, especially in the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the wider Western Pacific. And all of these recent moves that Tokyo is making, right, on defense, on missile exports, that will also be very beneficial for India in the long term. In the long term, it also prevents China from concentrating too much on the Indian Ocean and the Himalayan frontier, which is where our rivalry with China lies. But I think, having said that, India should still be extremely cautious about an escalation between them, because any sort of crisis in this region will severely disrupt trade, energy flows, technology supply chains, and just overall stability. And we've seen that now with the Iran crisis. So definitely another crisis in the region is not in our interest. But also, there is a big scope for us to deepen our sort of strategic cooperation with Japan. We already share a special strategic and global partnership. We have a lot of convergence in terms of policy. So whether Act East policy, Indian Pacific Oceans Initiative, Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. So there is a very sort of strong foundation already, and that will help us sort of expand cooperation in maritime domain awareness, naval exercises, more transfer in defense technology, critical minerals. So all of these areas are areas that we need to work more on with Japan. Now, having said that, so overall, I would say India should support Japan's role as a more sort of stabilizing partner, but it also needs to oppose any sort of coercive changes to the status quo, and at the same time build its own leverage through, as I said, defense technology upgrades and cooperation in supply chain. We're already a part of the Quad, and so there are a lot of areas that the Quad also works on. So yeah, we need to be very, very careful. We need to realize that look, Japan is becoming a more consequential military actor. China is obviously trying to frame that towards a more destabilizing and as a historically dangerous precedent. But for India, I think the issue is not, okay, we need to choose Japan over China in every dispute, or there's no issue sort of that. We need to ensure that we do not become a region where any sort of economic weaponization, coercion, unilateral pressures becomes normal. So yes, a stronger Japan is in our interest, but any escalation between China and Japan is not.
I think that's really helpful, Vanshika. Thank you so much. And just also very, I think, helpfully laying out the existing avenues where, India has been able to build a, little bit of trust and partnership with Japan in particular, and what it could look like for those fora to be leveraged possibly a little bit better, and perhaps with a little bit more intentionality, considering how some of these dynamics are playing out. I just, in the interest of time, I'm probably going to conclude our conversation here, but I think it was really an enriching chat just because it helped demystify a lot of what's playing out, to be able to track and mark how things have been shifting significantly, both, whether it's militarily or diplomatically between both countries, and just really an invitation for us to watch the space a little bit closer. So thank you so much for your time, Vanshika.
Thank you so much, Kripa.
Thank you. Take care.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.